My name is Olivia, and this is my story. The sweltering noon sun bore down upon her, merciless and smothering. The trees provided little shade and only reminded her of how hopelessly lost she was. They should have met 5 hours earlier in the cool shade of the ancient sycamore with the gnarled roots. He wasn't there. No one was. Now she couldn't summon a cab or anyone else. Her phone didn't offer a single reception bar in Solace. Cellular reception was supposed to have improved in recent years. She stumbled across a fallen branch but regained her balance before she fell. Her body raged against the sadistic self-abuse known as hiking. It seemed bizarre that people voluntarily subjected their bodies to the rigors and traumas of the practice. Her boyfriend was the hiker, not her. She paused to bend forward. She touched the ground and returned upright. She kicked her legs in an attempt to ease the muscle tension. Sweat trickled down her back and her face. Stupid cab driver. She thought he'd just been sarcastic when he muttered, "You're going to hike from here?" Yes, she was. Because she was an idiot. She shifted her backpack to her left hand and resumed a somewhat steady pace. She followed the next turn and almost screamed at the next stretch of barren gravel road. She'd stumbled onto the primitive lane 30 minutes earlier. If only roads out here actually went somewhere, because apparently the rules were different. Out here, roads didn't actually point towards destinations. They just existed. She'd left Richmond to hike a portion of the Virginia Creeper Trail with her boyfriend. She made it to Abingdon and took a cab to the exact spot where she was supposed to start. She followed the path just as his directions stated, but he hadn't been there. She waited an hour. She called out to him for what felt like forever, but there was never an answer. He told her not to worry about supplies because he would pack plenty for them both. Her stomach growled. Every inch of her body hurt from her head to her swollen, tender feet. She crested the next knoll and paused. An isolated wooden bench sat beside the road. She stared at it a moment. She must have suffered a heat stroke. Maybe it was a mirage. She gawked at the ancient bench a moment longer. Her eyes shifted to the dull glimmer of what appeared to be a few rooftops in the distance. The rusted metal jutted out just above the tree line. She was apparently on the outskirts of a village. His directions didn't mention a town. Of course, his directions didn't actually take her to a trail either. For some reason, it was a forest with no paths or indications of foot traffic. The cabbie looked at her like she was crazy. The paved road just stopped at its edge. She had no idea there was a reason. She walked for 30 minutes before she paused at the old sycamore. The rural road stretched out as far as she could see across sharply rising knolls and curves. The wooden buildings themselves were the only hints of civilization. They were probably empty. That would be her luck. What was she doing? Oh, she was in the middle of nowhere, utterly alone, and terrified of what that meant. She had no food, no water, no shelter. Why did he want to meet there and not show? That was a peculiar arrangement in retrospect. Why couldn't they have met in town? There wouldn't have been a big delay. What the hell kind of god-forsaken place was this? She kicked the wooden bench as she passed. Damn it, she followed the stupid map. Now, where had it gotten her? Hooterville, she grinned to herself. Her feet kicked up puffs of dust as she trudged the dirt road. She would just think of it as Green Acres. At least that was entertaining. Now, if I could just find Mr. Haney and ask him about a horse. Why were Davin's directions so screwed up? It said nothing about... about... She almost called it Hooterville, but that wasn't its name. The faded wooden sign on the left read, Evermore. Her anger flared as she moved towards the structures. They were supposed to be swimming by now. She was supposed to be enjoying a picnic lunch and swimming in a beautiful lake. There was no place to swim, nor was there food or people. There weren't any signs of a lake. She hadn't seen anyone since the cab drove off. She dropped on the next isolated bench. The worn wood gave slightly beneath her. She took another sip of the warm water from the half-drained bottle. Now that she was so thirsty, she needed to conserve. She only brought the bottle she carried with her, and it was nearly gone. A train whistle screamed in the distance. She sat upright. Oh, finally. Maybe there was hope. Maybe it wasn't as dismal as she feared. If she looked, she might find a spot level enough to flag the conductor down. Maybe there was a way to signal she was lost and without supplies. She needed a flat stretch of ground. She couldn't be running up and down the little knolls. She quickly rounded the next turn. Thank God. If nothing more, she could follow the tracks. She finished the turn and almost ran into the porch of an unexpected building. She found the village. A train depot lay hidden behind a sharp hill. It was the only building in sight along this stretch of the road. The hints of multiple roofs was only the strange, mismatched depot roof. The building's exterior had been worn by decades of rural elements, but it was beautiful. She ran to the open window. "Is this a passenger train?" "Yes, ma'am." The red-headed attendant smiled.
"The last passenger train in this part of the country."
His traditional train station clerk uniform showed no signs of the oppressive humidity. He hadn't even broken a sweat. She diverted her eyes a moment to avoid staring. She smiled with realization. Of course, it was a reenactment town, just like the colonial spots in Williamsburg. There wouldn't be any modern accoutrements or amenities of any kind. Their clothing and activities depicted the period as it would have been. There was probably a museum of some sort nearby, but she didn't have the time or energy to explore. She was leaving. Where does it go? The next train goes to Damascus. He looked at a nearby clipboard.
Yep, next one's Damascus.
Damascus? Davin mentioned stopping in Damascus. She would go there and wait for him. According to his version of how the hike would progress, they were supposed to arrive there tomorrow. It had motels and everything, some sort of hipster hiker mecca for the region. The outdoors without the outdoors, so to speak. She would wait for him there. She just wanted out of Hooterville. Evermore, whatever the hell it was. How much are tickets? The grand total will be $2. Her heart lifted as he handed the ticket over. The thick teal slip had two choices. Bound for Evermore was the first destination, but he'd punched the hole next to Bound for Other Points. She could have kissed him for that glorious slip of paper that promised a way out. She picked up her pack and shoved her ticket inside. Her elation for escaping the rampant naturalism around her was quickly overshadowed by suspicion. Why wasn't Davin there? Why did he lead her into an empty forest and without supplies? If he wanted to break it off, he could have just done so over the phone or even a text. She would have been fine. Not stranding her in the wilderness to starve. That was something altogether different. Something sinister. She didn't want to think of that. She took a deep breath to calm her thoughts. She was being unreasonable. She was hot and hungry, and her thoughts were chaotic and hostile. His absence bothered her more than it should. He could have gotten his own directions mixed up. Maybe he wasn't such an accomplished hiker. There were 1,000 logical reasons for the confusion. Rationale didn't overshadow her ire. Her brain wouldn't leave it alone. She followed his stupid directions. How could he leave her out there alone and without supplies? She could have died. Regardless of how little he might know of hiking, she knew even less. She was forthright and honest with him. She'd never been hiking. Ever. She distracted herself with dreams of her return to civilization. She was going to eat and eat, and then she would sleep. Maybe. When her lazy gluttony had ended, she would swim. He could have the mountains. He could stay in them. He could shove them in the nethermost region of his person. She would eat and drink until her body couldn't hold anymore. and then she would sleep it off. There wasn't going to be any moderation. She sat on the bench in the station. Evermore was an incredibly convincing oddity. She gazed from one side of the valley to the other, but there were no power lines or houses anywhere. If there was a museum near, it had to be well camouflaged. There weren't even signs of paved roads. Maybe the train was the only public way in and out. She couldn't see a clock anywhere. A few minutes later, she stood and paced. Her brain was a frenzy of questions. The train should have been there. It couldn't have been that far away. She hoped. She couldn't prevent her train of thought from returning to that same depot. Why wasn't he there? Did that mean he was lost out there somewhere? Maybe he'd gotten himself just as lost. A familiar whistle blew in the distance as the train approached. "Here she comes, ma'am." The little man inside called. She lifted her bag as the thunder of train wheels neared the station. The engine rounded the sharp bend. Steam puffed out of the shovel-nosed engine. 2 passenger cars followed the huge engine. She almost laughed aloud, but decided against it. She didn't need bad karma right now. Maybe it was all the little town could afford. Maybe it was more for aesthetics than function. She wouldn't complain. It was as beautiful as a limousine if it got her out of here. She climbed aboard the first car. Her stomach knotted up when she ascended the steps. People sat in every seat and some were standing. Everyone was dressed as if it were the 19th century. She swallowed hard and moved to the next car. She didn't look back. She could feel everyone stare at her as she walked away. The next car was empty, and she gave a deep sigh as she fell into the nearest seat. Thank God. Thank God this one is empty. The seats weren't particularly comfortable, but she didn't care. Simple maroon wool fabric was stretched across wooden planks. The glass in the windows appeared thin and fragile. She heard the door and held her breath. Would people begin streaming into this carriage too? She'd hoped for a quiet return to gather her thoughts. A woman around her age closed the door behind her. She wore a prim frock and entered by herself. She carried a pale green parasol that matched her long frilly dress. "Are you alone?" she whispered. "Yes." The stranger smiled. At least it was someone to talk with. The woman appeared just as out of place as she felt. No one in the front car wore such clean or colorful clothes. All of them appeared to be field hands, with dirty clothes and sunburned arms. She must have been an important character in the town. Thank heavens. She gingerly sat down in the seat across the aisle. She fussed with her dress and crossed her legs. I didn't know if there were any proper women traveling. She daintily arranged her bag and umbrella beside her. The stranger looked oddly familiar. Proper? She used the question to disguise her delayed stare. Who was she? There was nothing more aggravating than seeing a face so familiar and yet being unable to figure out who they were. She couldn't react as if she knew her or any details about her. She couldn't even recall a name to go with her face. But she'd seen her before. Didn't you notice? The only women up there are as filthy as the men. Come to think of it, they were. There were only a few women, and they were nearly indistinguishable from the men. She rolled her shoulders. Maybe they'll remain up there. I'm Gretchen. The woman held out her hand. She wore white silk gloves with black embroidered scrollwork along the wrist and underside of the arm. A line of black buttons traveled upward along the seam from her wrist to her elbow, where they disappeared beneath the sleeve of her dress. Hello, I'm Olivia. That's a beautiful name, Gretchen smiled. My mom was a big fan of Olivia de Havilland. She named me after her. Olivia de Havilland? She's an old actress. Oh, the theater. I love plays. She wasn't talking about plays, but decided to leave it alone. She pulled out her cell phone and tried it again. Still no bars. Oh, what is that? Gretchen studied the phone from her seat. It's just a cell phone, she shrugged. What do you do with them? She explained the function behind a cell phone, but then had to remind Gretchen of what a regular telephone was. They were convincing actors. She couldn't deny their performances. It really was like stepping back in time. The conversation gave way and took a strange but natural pattern. Apparently, there were more places like Evermore. Gretchen wasn't from the town and didn't seem to have any knowledge of the outside world. She eyed Gretchen's ticket. "Bound for Evermore?" The stub was punched in the opposite box as her own. "Yes, I'm here all the time." Their discussion eventually silenced, and she laid her head back. She closed her eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of the train. The carriage gently rocked back and forth. She felt so sleepy. It seemed like hours had passed since she boarded. She dozed for a few moments and awoke. Outside, it appeared only a few minutes had passed because the terrain hadn't changed. "I wonder how much longer it will be." She looked at her watch, but it had stopped. She looked over when Gretchen didn't answer. She thought she must have fallen asleep too, but Gretchen wasn't there. She probably went to the bathroom. Olivia tried the phone again, but nothing. The clock on her phone had remained at the same time as when she boarded. Must be a glitch. She pushed it back down into her bag. They could at least play some music while they traveled. They should have a television or something to occupy passengers. She was stuck without artificial entertainment of any kind. The cell phone rang on the seat a few minutes later. She stared at it a moment. It rang without reception. She picked it up. "Hello, you bitch," a man hissed. He sounded familiar. He sounded so damned familiar. It was Davin?
What the hell is your problem?
She demanded just as gruffly. How dare he call her with that kind of tone? She readied herself to battle with him. He wasn't doing that to her, not after what she'd just endured because of him. "You won't get away with it, Davin," a woman meekly whimpered from the other end of the line. "I swear I'll get you." Was someone with him? "Hello?" She asked into the phone, but it made no difference. The two didn't hear her. Maybe his cell phone cut on by accident. Or was the woman trying to call her? Was Davin with someone else? "You won't do shit." She'd never heard him speak with that voice. The insidious tone scared her, and she wasn't even there wherever they were. There was no mistake. She knew his voice anywhere. She listened as the conversation continued. "How could you? I'm carrying your child. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Not at all. You know about Olivia. She's a newer model, Evelyn. I like newer models. You should know that." Evelyn? His old girlfriend? It couldn't be. Evelyn took their child and fled to another state. She was paranoid and manipulative, wasn't she? Davin had alerted authorities, but no one had seen or heard from her since... Or had he? "Why do you have to kill me? You don't." "Yes, I'm afraid I do. I don't want to be paying for our little mistake for 18 years. You should have got rid of it when you had the chance." "Just let me go, Davin. Just let me go and I'll take the baby away somewhere. Just let us live. You'll never hear from us again." "Sure, I bet. Please, Davin." Her voice broke off into a sob. "It's been real swell, Evelyn." She heard the smile in his mocking voice. It was a revolting mental picture. She thought she knew him. They'd been together 2 years. The woman's sobs lasted until a gunshot rang out. Then there was a terrible silence. "You're next, you know." Gretchen now stood before her. She jumped in her seat and nearly threw the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Come on, Olivia." She sat across the aisle from her. "Wake up. You really think this is a dream? Someone, somewhere, is desperately trying to save you. I think you should listen." "Save me from what?" She knew the answer before she finished her reply. She couldn't defend him. That voice was his. It was his, and no one could say what happened to Evelyn because he was the last person to see her. The same fate as Evelyn. The same fate as Mary Swift. Evelyn wasn't the first, you know. There were others. Others? Victims, Olivia. It shouldn't be a surprise. You've had questions for some time. Yes, she did have questions. Why did the police talk to him about Evelyn's disappearance so much? He was the last person to see her alive. They'd known him, they'd talked to him before. But he was the one to alert authorities that she'd gone missing. If he'd killed her, he wouldn't have drawn attention to it. She stopped talking. Details in his stories conflicted. She hadn't noticed them before. She also had questions about his obsession with privacy, his unusual business trips, and the secrets he kept about hiking. As much as he loved to talk about hiking, he seldom talked about his previous hikes. She just thought it was a quirk, not that he genuinely might have things to hide. Do you honestly believe he alerted authorities? Evelyn had family, Olivia. They were worried about her, and they still are. They knew Davin didn't want a baby. The police talked to him so much because he was the last one to see her alive, or otherwise. She's dead. Why do you think he loves the mountains so much? Gretchen returned to her seat. It's because he can show his true self here. He can hide the evidence. I was supposed to meet him. We were going to have a weekend away. Yes, that's been said before. Why do all his old girlfriends seem to disappear, Olivia? She waited for a response, but Olivia couldn't say anything. She didn't want to be next. I don't want you to be next either. Gretchen read her thoughts as she stood back up. That's why you're here. It's why you'll do what I say if you want to live. Go back, excuse yourself, and leave. His interests have been piqued elsewhere. You have the chance none of us had. Just quickly and quietly get out of his life. But he'll do it again. I need to stop him. Time is already out. He knows it. He's going to be more aggressive than ever. The police are waiting. Sit back and relax. You won't do anything else. Detective Eisenhower already knows. He's waiting on him to return. Davin may be looking for a final victim, or you might have been the final victim. She felt foolishly guilty when she thought of the stubby, red-faced detective. She'd actually believed Mortimer Eisenhower was just harassing Davin for no reason, that he had nothing else to do. She was so stupid. Gretchen put a hand on her shoulder. Why would he encourage you not to pack supplies and then not show? Think long and hard about it, Olivia. That's a death sentence, and a terrible one. It would have taken days to die out there. He directed you to a spot that was miles from the nearest path and much farther from the trail itself. The front door of the compartment slid open, and the people from the front car streamed in. We're only looking out for you. Gretchen shook her head. You remember that, Olivia. We're not the evil ones. He killed us all. Oh, and one final thing. We? She looked up at the massive man who stood over her. She tried to avoid his powerful glare. Davin killed them all. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. There had to be 20 people there. She shook the days long enough to mutter, What? You know me as Evelyn. I went by my middle name during my life. I know far more about Davin than you do. She pulled the front of her dress apart to reveal a gaping hole in the center of her chest. She couldn't scream. She couldn't react, because everything happened too quickly. The mountain of a man reached down and grabbed her. He roughly picked her up and threw her. How did he pick her up like that? She was nothing. She was 5'6" and had an athletic frame despite her abhorrence for hiking. She was a jogger. Yet he picked her up as if she was a rag doll. Despite her kicking and straining against him, he threw her out the car's back door. She opened her mouth to scream, but only got the wind knocked out of her upon impact. She rolled on the hard earth. She felt woozy and dazed when she stopped. The train was gone, as were the tracks. There was only a barren dirt outline where train tracks had once been. She slowly sat up. Where was she now? She lowered her head and wept. She was so alone and so tired. Why couldn't they throw her near a town? Now she was bruised and banged up from the fall as well. She eventually regained her composure. She had to move on or she would die. She took a deep breath and stood. Blisters had formed on the backs of her heels. Every step was painful. She looked ahead and saw rooftops protruding just above the tree lines. Not just rusted metal formations, but honest-to-God modern rooftops. They had shingles and metal. It was a town. She listened to the precious rumble of engines and the glorious bustle of people. "Oh my God!" she heard Davin yell in the distance. "What the hell are you doing here?" She heard footsteps running towards her. Her first instinct was to tell him everything. She couldn't. "You're next, you know," she heard Gretchen whisper. I fell down a hillside earlier. It was all she felt safe telling him. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close as if it were all some silly mix-up. Just a minor incident that didn't even warrant attention. "What the hell are you doing here?" repeated in her mind like an angry loop. It was the same tone he used in that phone call with Evelyn. He hadn't believed she would live. She did. The knowledge ripped her heart in two, but she couldn't cry. She couldn't react in any way. Another set of steps walked towards them. It was a woman. "This is Monica. She hikes with us sometimes." Monica evidently wore a perpetual frown and had 2 slits for eyes. Or she was enraged at the presence of his actual girlfriend. "His interests have been piqued elsewhere." Evelyn's voice came again. "Where were you?" The only thing left to do was to act as normally as possible. She looked him in the eye and ignored the third party that tagged along behind them. She had to see his reaction for herself. "You said you'd meet me." "I'm sorry, honey. I don't know what happened. I waited and waited, but you weren't there." They started towards the busy part of town. "I thought you stayed at home." "Liar," went through her mind. That was a lie. His spotless clothes had just come from a suitcase. Hiking, my ass. He wore casual cotton shoes, not hiking boots, and they were pristine. His cool skin smelled of soap, not hours out on the trail. She watched the woman as they walked. Monica didn't take her eyes from him. Monica's body visibly tensed when she put her arm around Davin's waist. She just wanted to go back to civilization. She opened her pack to get her water bottle, and her ticket sat beside it. She was going home. She would make up an excuse when she had rested and ate. Even though she'd experienced it all, everything remained unbelievable. She'd watched a television special on neighbors who inadvertently lived beside serial killers. The first thing out of their mouths was usually something like, "He was such a quiet guy. How could a killer speak so softly as he had with her for 2 years? How could a voice so evil be so wonderful?" He gently pulled away and she let him. She shuddered when he released her. She couldn't think of it. She had to get home. Had to get away from him. Monica's eyes narrowed and her fists clenched when he kissed the top of her head. She suddenly remembered Evelyn's pictures before he burned them. No wonder Gretchen looked so familiar. "You're next, you know." Her words whispered. No, she wouldn't be. Less than 24 hours after her arrival in Damascus, she was in her own home. She told Davin she had the stomach flu, but he could stay and finish his hike. She even returned her plane ticket and got a rental car. She didn't want to be on the same plane with him and didn't trust him to stay where he was, waiting to finish the job. As soon as she got in the door, she telephoned the detective. She gave Eisenhower a statement that detailed her ordeal in the wilderness. He accepted it, or so she believed. She was certain to include when Davin would be back. It was the least she could do after that excursion in the wild. Evelyn was right. Her involvement made little difference. A body had already been located near the trail. A hiker found a purse by the trail that contained identification for Mary Swift, and, coincidentally, Davin was the last person to see her alive, too. The authorities were working in the area because cadaver dogs had picked up a scent. Detective Eisenhower and several police cruisers waited for him when he returned. She hid at the end of his street. She parked where she could peek around the last house on his block. Monica Fry, his hiking friend, was with him. She was also taken in for questioning. Eisenhower said Fry would be charged as an accessory, but could get a reduced sentence if she testified against Davin. She claimed she had no knowledge of his intentions for Olivia, but the evidence said she knew everything. Days passed, and she believed everything was nearly normal. She still dreamed of that train and of Evelyn. The authorities held him while they gathered evidence. Eisenhower surprised her when he showed up on her doorstep. She awkwardly held the door for him as he came in. They made small talk a moment before he began. "It's good you got away from him before he could do anything." "Yes, I felt better about it than I thought I would." "I have news for you." "Me?" "Yeah, on your town. Evermore." "Oh, what about it?" "The only town with that name in the state was abandoned 100 years ago. It went belly up when the coal mine closed. You say you got on a train there? I guess I might have been wrong. I probably got confused due to exhaustion and dehydration. She tried to ignore his studious gaze, but she couldn't. He knew there was more to it. What was the good of hiding what happened? She danced around the question for a moment longer, but eventually told him everything. He would probably advise her to seek medical help. He leaned back and grinned.
That was some exhaustion, wasn't it?
What? She stared at him. He had to think she was crazy. She didn't know how to react to his casual return. The state sent a group to investigate the town. I asked them to check it out. I couldn't find any contemporary information on the place. They visited the town. It was empty, but they found a body there. Body? In the old train station. We're currently working on matching dental records. Another one? My thoughts exactly. The remains are female and her belongings were there. I think we can safely assume who his victims were because their things have been left at the scene, a suitcase and a purse. It's strange, though. This body was tied at the wrists and ankles, but apparently the rope wasn't strained at all. We're thinking the body was dead before it was bound. She was wrapped in an old green and white comforter. Evelyn. That was the identification beside the body. Gretchen Evelyn Hale. She cleared her throat. She was shot? Yes, there was a deep trauma to the rib cage. How did you know? Her mind rocketed back to the telephone call and Gretchen's chest. The open wound had stopped bleeding years earlier. She thought of that ticket and shuddered. Bound forevermore should be bound forevermore. She opened her purse to remove her wallet as Eisenhower watched. She pulled out the ticket she'd kept hidden and laid it on the table. He took it and stared. He rubbed it between his fingers. Like I said, that was a terrible case of exhaustion. Do you believe you could testify in court? Without mentioning Evermore? Yes. It appears you escaped a serial killer, Olivia. I don't want his defense to have an advantage. If you bring your experience up, the jury might find you untrustworthy. The defense would love such an opportunity. I understand. For now, we'll just keep Evermore between us.